So let's start with the next question. How can we write data-driven test using NUnit and Visual Studio Test? Now, in our previous example or in our previous sample which we had seen, the biggest problem with the previous sample was that the test data was hard-coded inside the program logic itself. Definitely, when you're actually working with big projects, you would like to simulate different kind of scenarios. You would like to expect different kind of expectation from the scenarios. So in other words, you would like to provide test data from Excel file, from SQL Server, or from an XML file. So so in summing up all, you would like to separate the test cases, the NUnit or the VSTS test cases from the data. So in this video, what we'll do is that we'll try to understand that how we can write data-driven test using NUnit as well as Visual Studio Test. So let's first try to understand that how we can write data-driven test using NUnit. NUnit has provided a class called as test case data. Now test case data is nothing but it's a class which helps you to create test cases for your NUnit functions. So the test case data basically takes in the input parameters which are needed for the test case, and it returns out output values for the test case. Now currently the function which I am testing is basically takes in a per product cost and number of products. So I have only two inputs and one output to be returned. So what I've done is that first I have created my test cases over here and I've added them to an array list collection. Now if you want, you can take these test cases from SQL Server or from an Excel file, but currently for the simplicity's sake I have created objects of test case data hard-coded in my program. So what I've done is that I have defined a simple array list and I have added my test case data to the array list. And now in order to execute the test case data, what I'm doing is that I'm running a for each loop on the array list and I'm returning the test case. Now these test cases are passed to your unit test, current unit test function, by using the test case source. So the function which is basically going to take these test cases, you need to attribute them with the test case source. And in the test case source, you need to provide the test cases, the function name, which is the function name which is returning the test case data. So at this moment, my function is test cases. So I've defined the name in the test case source as test cases. So now what will happen is that when this NUnit will, when NUnit will run the unit test on this function, or when it will run this unit test, it will first go here. It will fetch the first record, that is the first test case from it. It will fire the test case on this unit test, and whatever is the returned value from my class, that is CLS invoice calculation, it will try to match with the return value of the test case data provided. And in this way, you can define your data-driven test using NUnit. Now, when you actually go to your NUnit panel, you will see that your test case calculation now has now has 4 test cases which it can run, and every of these 4 test cases we have also defined the output value which we expect. So if you see in your unit test, there is no hard coding of test data. So now you can run this test. So let me select this and you can run the test, and everything has passed currently. So in case anything fails, let's say that I go to my CLS invoice calculation class, and let me just inject a small defect here. Let's say this is a subtraction, and now if I run my NUnit test case, it will fail, and it will also tell me that, okay, so let me just run it again. Okay, so it will also tell me that the expected was 100. That's the first test case over here. So if you look at, if you remember our first test case which we have written, it expects 100, but because it was a subtraction, it is getting 0. The expected was 400, but it is getting 0. So in this way, all my test cases are run and checked against that unit test function. So that's how we can write data-driven test using NUnit. Let's move ahead and let's try to understand that how we can do a data-driven test using Visual Studio unit testing framework. So here's what I've done. I have created a simple table in SQL Server called as test product data, and it has 3 fields: number of products, per product cost, and expected value. So this table will have my test data which I want to provide to my Visual Studio unit testing function. So here's what I have number of products, which is basically the total number of products you're going to buy, the per product cost for every product, and the expected value. So I have three test cases provided in my table, and now what I want is that I want to provide this data to my unit testing, and I want that Visual Studio Test should run each of these test cases and see the expected as well as actual value, and determine that if the test has passed or failed. Now, in order to provide the table data to my unit test function, I need to attribute the unit test function with something called as data source. In data source, first I need to provide the provider where the data is lying. At this moment, it is SQL Server, so the provider value I have provided as system.data.sql client. The second is I need to provide the connection string. So at this moment, my database is test data, and my table name is test product data, from which I need to fetch the values. And finally, I also need to provide how I actually want to run the test case. So at this moment, I just want to run the test case row by row sequentially. So what Visual Studio unit testing framework will do is that it will go to the table, it will go to the database, it will fetch the first record, it will come here, it will take that record and fire on the unit test method. Now inside the unit test function, you can access the value of the columns by using test context.data row. So over here I have set test context.data row and the column index. So 0 corresponds to number of products, 1 corresponds to per product cost, and 2 corresponds to the expected value. And then finally I create the object of CLS invoice calculation class, on which I'm going to basically execute my unit test. I provided my input values, and then I say asserts.r equal that this is my actual value I'm getting, and this is my expected value which I've got from the database. Are they equal? If they're equal, please do provide. If they are equal, that means the test case has passed, and if they are unequal, that means the test case has failed. So now let's run this test case and see how the output looks like. Now, the time you run the test case, you will see that it basically starts fetching each record from the SQL Server database and starts firing the test. The second one is basically our data-driven test. So you can see that it has executed 3 test cases. So if you double click on this, it will display saying that it has executed 3 test cases, and all of these 3 test cases have passed. So for each of the record in SQL Server, for each of the record in SQL Server, it has fired the test cases. Now let's do one thing. Let's go and inject a small defect in our invoice calculation class. So let's make this plus. Let me compile this project. And now let's go again and run our Visual Studio unit test. So let's go to the Solution Explorer. Let's go to our Visual Studio test project and just let me run it. Let's do one thing. Let's also put a debug point so that we can understand how internally it functions. Now definitely all of our test cases will fail because it's now not a product, but it's more of addition. So that's our first test case which will fail. This first test case is nothing but the hard-coded test case of a previous sample. So that's the hard-coded test case, that is this one. So the failed one is this test case. Now the second one is our data-driven test. So you can see that it has taken the first value from the database, and it starts the first row from the database. So basically it has gone to the SQL Server, it has fetched 1010, and now it started firing, or it started actually executing the unit test. So it goes here, it goes to asserts.r equal, and then checks if the condition is valid, and then it goes for the next record. So in this way it executes 3 unit tests using the data provided by SQL Server, and now all of these unit tests will fail, and it will also give us saying that why the unit tests have failed. So you can see over here that the expected value was 100 from our database. That's our first record. So let me just open the table data. So what is saying that the expected value was 100, but this has given 20, so it has failed. The second, it says that the expected value was 400 while the actual value we got was 40. So in this way, it has executed all the three test cases or test cases provided in SQL Server. So in this way, we can execute data-driven test using Visual Studio Test. I hope that this session was useful. In the forthcoming sessions, what we'll do is that we will also look into how we can do load testing using Visual Studio Test System, and also we'll look into that how we can do database testing. Means in other words, when in projects normally you have insert, update, and delete. So how we can use Visual Studio Test to basically check for the SQL Server data and see that the test cases have passed or not.